أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وبه نستعين إنه خير ناصر ومعين ثم الصلاة والسلام والتحية والإكرام على سيدنا ومولانا وطبيب قلوبنا وشفيع ذنوبنا أبي القاسم محمد صلوا على محمد. So our numbers are fewer tonight, so we have to compensate for the fewer numbers with a louder salawat. وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين. السلام عليك يا أبا عبد الله وعلى الأرواح التي حلت بفنائك. عليك مني سلام الله أبدا ما بقيت وبقي الليل والنهار، ولا جعله الله آخر العهد مني لزيارتكم. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين وعلى 9 المعصومين من ذرية الحسين، واللعنة الدائمة على أعدائهم أجمعين من الآن إلى يوم الدين. أما بعد، فقد قال الله الحكيم في محكم كتابه الكريم: أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. يا أيتها النفس المطمئنة ارجعي إلى ربك راضية مرضية فادخلي في عبادي وادخلي جنتي. صدق الله العلي العظيم. صلوا على محمد وآله الطاهرين. Dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. On this final night of our discussions for these few nights of Muharram, so far we have been discussing the topic of wilaya, this most central and most foundational topic, not only of the followers of the school of Ahlul Bayt, but in fact according to the words and the ahadith of our Ahlul Bayt, the Imams, we know that Islam itself, not just Shia Islam, but Islam itself is established on this concept of wilaya. And we've been discussing it in all of its various dimensions, from our wilaya and our intimate connection with God, with the Prophet, and with particular mu'mineen who we know are the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. And last night we discussed this issue of the wilaya that we have towards fellow believers. Not just our wilaya to the heads of our religion, but as well to the believers that we have in our community, the people who we see, for example, in the masajid, and who we have a bond with, a bond of friendship and brotherhood with. We talked about the importance of this wilaya between believers. And just to kind of summarize for those who weren't here, there are various ahadith that say that this wilaya that we have towards fellow believers, mu'min and mu'mina, both men and women among the believers, how this wilaya is a wilaya that Allah has created. It's a connection and an intimate relationship that Allah has created. This is as well stated in the Quran itself. Al-mu'minuna wal-mu'minat ba'duhum awliya'u ba'd. That the mu'mineen and the mu'minat are connected, intimately connected with each other, some to others. And try to understand, well, why does Allah create why does He focus on this particular wilayah among all of the various connections that we have? Why does Allah focus on this particular type of wilayah? And one of the possible wisdoms that Allah has placed in His creation, and why He mentions and focuses on this wilayah between mu'mineen and mu'minat, is that Allah tries to show us our connection with Him, our wilayah with Him, through our relationship that we have with other believers. We can only really understand what the love of Allah is and how we're supposed to love Allah if we can find other forms and other means of love in our life. If somebody doesn't know what love is, then they can't possibly love Allah. And we see that this is a fact in our own understanding. When we're trying to understand something, time and time again in the Quran, it explains to us various concepts and various realities of the world through things that we have a very personal connection to or a very personal experience with. So for example, in the Quran, when Allah is describing for us the Day of Judgment, none of us have experienced the Day of Judgment, right? We haven't even experienced life after death. And so we don't really understand what it means, for example, for the souls to be judged on this huge plane, and what it means for example, someone to be given blessings upon blessings in the hereafter, or what it means for someone to be punished and go through torment in the hereafter. We don't have any idea what that means. And yet when we look in the Quran, we see that Allah describes the hereafter in terms of things we understand. Not just that, but in terms of things that we have a very close experience with. So for example, Allah in Surah Al-Fajr, He explains the final point in this earth, that final moment in this earth when the earth is destroyed and it falls apart. Allah explains it in terms of images that we can understand. He says, فَإِذَا دُكَّتِ الْأَرْضُ دَكًّا دَكًّا وَجَاءَ رَبُّكَ وَالْمَلَكُ صَفًّا صَفًّا. Allah in Surah Al-Fajr, He says that in that final moment when the earth and this entire world is destroyed, He says that it's that moment when the earth is made into dust. Something that Arabs of that time knew very well. What is dust? They can see it around them. They experience it. Right? They see that Allah is saying that this entire earth is going to be made is going to be destroyed to such an extent that it's going to be made like this dust that you see around you. So all of these mountains and these really stable things that we see around us, they're all going to be made into particles of dust. And then He says, وَجَاءَ رَبُّكَ وَالْمَلَكُ صَفًّا صَفًّا. And your Lord and the various angels are all going to come in rows. وَجِيءَ يَوْمَئِذٍ بِجَهَنَّمْ. And Jahannam itself is going to be brought, and you are going to see it. So when we're trying to understand what the Quran is telling us, it's explaining to us the Day of Judgment, this thing that we have no idea about, we have no way of understanding until we actually see it. What Allah does is He explains to us this Day of Judgment in terms of things that we experience on a day-to-day basis. So we know what it is like to see dust around us, right? When something is destroyed and crumbles into small particles. We know what it means to, for example, a king to come in rows with his soldiers or with the people who he commands. And so Allah explains that otherworldly reality in terms of things that we can understand. And going back to this idea of wilayah that we have with fellow mu'mineen, maybe one of the reasons why Allah places this wilayah, this connection that we have to fellow believers, is so that once we are able to develop a love develop love with, say for example, our parents, our brothers and sisters, and then as well among community members. If we are able to, for example, forgive one of our fellow community members, and forgive, for example, our brother or sister, or our children, and have that bond and that connection with them, then we can maybe use that experience and create a bond and a connection with Allah and with His Prophet. Until and unless we understand what love is on a very visceral and a very intimate level. And in fact, our bonds and our connections with our, for example, fathers and mothers, our children, is the strongest bonds and connections that we have with anybody else, right? We're willing to, until somebody actually has a relationship as a father with their child or as a mother with their child, they don't really know what it means to sacrifice. Right? Until somebody becomes a parent, they don't know what it means to give up everything they have for another human being. And so maybe one reason why Allah creates these relationships in our lives is so that we have this experience. And then once we turn to Allah, then we know what it means like for a father to forgive his son. We know what it means like for example, a mother to forgive her daughter, and that's how we react with Allah. That's how we interact with Allah. We interact almost like a son, a person who has time and time again disobeyed his father. And we know that humbleness and that humility that a son must show to his father when he has made a mistake. Once we know that, then we can appreciate our relationship with Allah. Then we can appreciate our relationship with the Prophet or with the Imams. And so we take these as almost as symbols or as metaphors to see what our relationship with Allah should be. Not just what it is, but what it should be. There's an ideal that we're trying to get to. This is a journey that we're trying to take part in. And so we have where we are right now and where we want to be. If I have such a deep love for my children, then at least I should have that same amount of love for the Prophet. If I have such a deep love that I'm willing to sacrifice everything I have for my children, then at least that is the least amount that I should have for the Prophet. Right? And then from there I can start to begin my journey in getting closer to the Prophet and to the Ahlul Bayt. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. And so this is, again, the journey that we have with the Prophet and with the Ahlul Bayt. If we see it in terms of wilayah, if we see it in terms of our intimate relationship and our connection with the Ahlul Bayt, then maybe we can use this as a means for us to bring their teachings and their lessons ever closer and ever more applicable to our lives. And we've already talked about many of the different dimensions of wilayah. But one of the most important lessons that wilayah gives us is how real our relationship has to be. How real our connection to the Prophet has to be. It's not just certain things that we learn in a book. It's not just certain things that we maybe learn in Sunday school or we look at the Quran and we try to understand what the Quran says. It's our connection with a human being who is the Prophet. It's our connection with the Ahlul Bayt who are human beings just like us, except that they have a connection with Allah as well. And so we see that in the Quran, Allah time and time again points to this fact. He says, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم لقد كان لكم في رسول الله أسوة حسنة. Right? That it is for you a perfect example in the Prophet himself. Allah has created a perfect example for you in the Prophet. Now, when we're looking at how we're supposed to understand our religion, one of the most important and central ways that the Quran tells us is through these human beings, through these human beings that Allah has placed in His creation. And one of the times that we remind ourselves, and Allah reminds us, is in fact in Surah Al-Fatiha. Right, so in Surah Al-Fatiha, what do we recite every single day, a number of different times? Say, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, Maliki Yawmiddin, Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in, Ihdina as-sirata al-mustaqim. When we say Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in, we're saying, Oh Allah, we turn to you for worship. We worship only you. Wa iyyaka nasta'in, and we only ask you. Right? So we do dua to Allah. Now, what is it that we do dua for? Ihdina as-sirata al-mustaqim. Guide us to the right path. Now the question is, well, what is this right path? Last time we talked about how the Quran describes sometimes what it's trying to say, how the Quran speaks to us. Sometimes the Quran will tell us a general concept, and then in the ayah after it, or in the few ayahs after it, Allah describes for us in a very detailed way what that concept is. So Allah in this Surah Al-Fatiha, it explains to us, He explains to us what this Sirat al-Mustaqim is. A lot of times we're not sure. What is the right path, that straight path that Allah has determined for us? The way Allah describes it is in terms of certain people. اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم. Certain people. Those people who you have given blessings to. Those people who you have given bounties to. And then, not just that, He doesn't just define for us the people that Allah loves, but as well He defines Sirat al-Mustaqim in terms of the people that Allah hates. أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. Right? Both in terms of the people that Allah loves and gives His blessings to, and in terms of the people that Allah hates and those who are misguided. Allah is defining for us what Sirat al-Mustaqim is in terms of specific people. That's the best way that we can understand what the right path is. It's in terms of specific people. Both in terms of the people that we're supposed to follow, and as well in terms of the people that we're not supposed to follow. What this is trying to tell us, one of the things that Allah is trying to tell us here, is that Islam is not just a set of principles that I have given you. Islam is not just a book that Allah has revealed to us, but Islam is something that you have to live, that has to be applied in your lives. And you have to see it in action. We have to understand how Islam is going to change our lives. It's a lived experience. It's a lived tradition. It's not just something that we think about or something that maybe we identify with. That's not what Islam is. Islam is in terms of human beings and how we interact with each other and how we interact with those who have implemented what Islam tells us. And so when the Prophet, Al-Mustafa, Nabi Al-Mustafa, sallallahu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad, he says, إِنِّي تَارِكُمْ فِيكُمُ الثَّقَلَيْنِ كِتَابَ اللَّهِ وَعِتْرَتِي. I am leaving amongst you two things. Both the book of Allah that you can read and you can study, وَعِتْرَتِي, أَهْلَ بَيْتِي. Not just a set of principles and a book that you can read, but how these principles are going to be enacted and applied in a person's life. And the best example that we have is the Ahlul Bayt of the Prophet. And that is really where we understand our religion. How is our religion applied? All of those principles that we understand, how are those principles applied? It's applied in a person's life. And so when we are trying to understand all of the various principles that Allah gives us, for example, that we have to worship Allah, that we have to be kind to our neighbors and to our friends and to our family members, that we have to, for example, give in charity. A lot of times when we try to apply this to our lives, a lot of times we see that it's actually really difficult, right? Where we have to be both kind to our family members or our community, but then a lot of times our community doesn't respond in kindness. Or for example, our family members don't respond in kindness. So we are a lot of times put in a very difficult state. How do we apply all of those principles that we are given and that we are told in our lives. For example, I mentioned the example of salat yesterday. That Allah tells us, and the Prophet tells us, that Salat al-Farida, the wajib prayers, the wajib namaz that we do, one of the components of this wajib namaz is the fact that we should do it in jama'ah. So now when we do this salat, this namaz in jama'ah, a lot of times we understand that, of course, namaz is our connection to Allah, right? We're trying to get closer and closer to Allah. But then at the same time, we have to do it in jama'ah. We have to do it in congregation. And of course, we know that if we were to do this same prayer in our homes and in a quiet and maybe a relaxing place, then our attention would be much more in our salat. We wouldn't be distracted by all of the things that maybe the kids and the other people who are reciting prayer near us. But when we come in jama'ah, we don't have that same attention. We can't focus as much as we can in another place. But what Allah is telling us, and what the Prophet tells us, is that don't just do this prayer at home. Do this prayer in congregation. What Allah is saying is that there are various priorities that I have set in my religion. One of those priorities is your connection to me. Another one of those priorities is your connection to your fellow believers. And your connection to me should be in terms of your connection to your fellow believers. So if you are doing wajib prayer, do it in congregation. Yes, it's important for you to have a direct connection to me and for you to focus on your prayer. That's definitely very important. But at the same time, for your wajib prayers, make sure that you're also connected to other believers. If you want to connect yourself to me and have that absolute focus, do your mustahabbat. Do your mustahab prayers in private, in a very secluded place that you won't get distracted. So we're seeing that Allah is setting up various priorities for us. All of our ahkam aren't at the same level. There are certain priorities that we have, and we can only really understand what those priorities are when we look at the life of the Ahlul Bayt. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. So we can only really understand what those priorities are when we see how the Ahlul Bayt lived their lives. When we look in the ahadith of the Ahlul Bayt, for example, we see that there are various recommendations and precautions that the Ahlul Bayt give us. When somebody, for example, opens a book of hadith, a lot of times it's very confusing. Well, should I do this thing or that thing? Should I give zakat or sadaqah to the people around me, or should I care more about my own family? Should I, for example, go out and, work and provide for my family, even if it means that I stay away from them for a very long time? Or should I give more of my own personal time to my family? Which one should I do? When we're trying to learn from the Ahlul Bayt, we shouldn't just look at specific ahadith, at one specific hadith or another. That's very important and that's very good. We should always read the ahadith. Well, what's more important is that we look at the entire life of the Ahlul Bayt. We see what things did they prioritize over other things. One example of this is when we look in the Khilafah of Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib. There is this ayah of the Quran, the story that the Quran tells us, where Nabi Musa was called to the mountain. For those who were here last night, I'd mentioned this story. Nabi Musa was called to the mountain to get the message that Allah was going to give him. And then, as he is away from Bani Israel, he leaves his brother Harun to look over the affairs of Bani Israel. And when Nabi Musa is gone, Bani Israel begin to take this famous calf as their idol, that famous golden calf that they create. It is when Nabi Musa is gone and he is getting the commandments, and he has placed Nabi Harun among his people, that these people take the calf as their idol. And they start worshipping this idol and so on. And what's interesting is when Nabi Musa comes back to his people, and he looks at Nabi Harun and tells him, "Did I not leave you as my representative among these people? Why did you allow them to commit this gravest of sins, which is shirk? Right? Why did Nabi Harun let the Bani Israel commit this shirk? Shirk, after all, is a terrible sin. It's the only sin that Allah does not forgive until people stop doing shirk. And this exchange between Nabi Harun and Nabi Musa is, I think, telling of why it's so important that we look at the life of the Ahlul Bayt. So in Surah Taha, Nabi Harun says, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم قال يا ابن لا تأخذ بلحيتي ولا برأسي إني خشيت أن تقول فرقت بين بني إسرائيل ولم ترقب قولي. Nabi Harun says, "Oh my brother, don't take my beard and take my hair." According to how Quran describes it for us, Nabi Musa was very, very upset. So he takes the beard and the hair of Nabi Harun and he is sort of telling him, asking him why he did this. And Nabi Harun says in response, "Oh my brother, don't be so upset at me. I was afraid that once you come back, you would tell me that you have split up my community. And you have not paid attention to what I have said." When we look in the life of Amir al-Mu'mineen, Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam, we see that this same situation happens after the death of the Prophet. That Amir al-Mu'mineen comes and he is burying the body of the Prophet, and the Muslims are deciding who is going to rule over the Muslims. And then we have other people among the Muslims nowadays come and ask us, well, if Amir al-Mu'mineen really cared about the Khilafah, why didn't he go and make his claim, and why didn't he, for example, go and take up arms and say, really make his claim very forcefully? Why didn't he do that? Isn't the Khilafah important for you followers of the Ahlul Bayt? Well, why didn't Amir al-Mu'mineen, Ali ibn Abi Talib, why didn't he take up the sword and go and fight for it? We see that what Amir al-Mu'mineen does in his life is that he sets up these various priorities. He sees that, for example, in this verse of the Quran, Nabi Harun sets certain priorities over others. Just as Nabi Musa set the priority where the Muslims should not be disunited and split apart, that is the number one priority that Nabi Musa set, even above shirk. Nabi Musa set that priority even above shirk. What Amir al-Mu'mineen does is he says, the Prophet has commanded me not to split up this ummah in this most fragile state, when the Prophet has passed away, when he has reached that state of shahada. I am commanded by the Prophet himself to not split up the community. I am commanded by the Prophet himself. So I'm not going to take up arms because I know the effect of this is going to be the splitting up of the community. That does not mean that Amir al-Mu'mineen does not want to claim his khilafah. And we see that time and time again, Amir al-Mu'mineen says, I am the most deserving of this position than any one of you. I am the most deserving. I'm the closest person to the Prophet. I am like Harun was to Musa. And how was Harun to Musa? Harun followed the command of Musa to the word. And so when we look in history, we see the reaction of Imam Ali alayhi salam after the death of the Prophet. We see that he does not split up the community. He says, fine, for the time being, I am going to not make my claim, and for me to be able to keep the community together. He makes his claim time and time again, but he says, I am not going to split up the community beyond this point. What this is trying to tell us, what Amir al-Mu'mineen tries to tell us, is that not just that there are these various principles and these various priorities that we have, but what Amir al-Mu'mineen says is that you think this khilafah is the most important thing in the world. But what I am going to do is not just set up the same principles and the same priorities that the Prophet set, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you what the actual priority of Islam is. And that is that I'm going to revive and keep alive the memory of the Prophet himself. I know the memory of the Prophet. I know what the Prophet taught better than any one of you. And so what I'm going to do, since you are denying me this khilafah, and since I know the Prophet does not want me to split up the community, I know I am going to begin to teach the community. I am going to try to guide the community through other means. Right? Setting up those priorities. And so when we look in the life of the Ahlul Bayt, we come to realize that Islam isn't just a matter of a certain set of beliefs or even a certain set of actions. All of those are very important. But what Islam is trying to tell us is look at the lives of the Ahlul Bayt. If you're really trying to understand what Islam is, don't just open the Quran and say, Hasbuna kitab Allah. That's actually going against the word of the Prophet. What Islam is trying to tell us is look at the life of the Ahlul Bayt and to understand Islam through the priorities that they set up. And in our lives, that becomes very important. When we look at our own lives and try to understand how to implement the message of Islam in our own lives, we see that a lot of times the most religious in our community, most seemingly religious sometimes, are actually some of those who aren't able to implement those same principles. Because a lot of times what we understand as Islam is just certain actions. But instead we have to look a little bit deeper. We have to learn from our Ahlul Bayt in terms of those priorities. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. And so we see that the Prophet of Islam says, Aliyun ma'al haq wal haqqu ma'a Ali. Yaduru haythu ma dar. Ali is with haq, and haq is with Ali. The truth is with Ali, and Ali is with the truth. And the Prophet, what's interesting in this hadith is that what he says after this point is, it turns wherever it turns. In the Arabic, the Prophet doesn't specify, is it haq that turns wherever Ali turns, or is it Ali that turns wherever haq turns? If we want to understand what haq is, should we go to Ali? Or if we want to follow Ali, should we go to the haq? The Prophet doesn't explain it. He leaves it open. He says, if you want to understand Islam, go to Ali. And if you want to understand who Ali is, go to Islam. These two never separate. These two never split apart. If we really want to understand what the teachings of our religion is, we have to learn it from the words and the lives, most importantly, the lives of the Ahlul Bayt. And so when we're trying to understand what wilaya is, we see that one of the most important lessons that wilaya gives us is that wilaya is something that we implement in our lives. It's not just a badge of honor that we have. It's not just something that we have to give, say for example, pride in. It's something that we have to implement in our lives. And until we do that, we can't really realize and understand the teachings of the Ahlul Bayt, particularly about wilaya. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Now, when we look in the lives of the Ahlul Bayt, one of the most important moments, if not the most important moment in the history of the Ahlul Bayt are these events of Karbala. Are these events that took place on Ashura. And we see that it's almost as if all of the teachings of the Ahlul Bayt are contained and focused in Ashura. In fact, we have ahadith after ahadith which tell us that all of those lessons that the Muslims were supposed to learn, they are revealed in Ashura. In the Quran, Allah talks about His creation in very stark terms, in very difficult terms. For example, when He is describing the people and the creatures that Allah has created, He describes them in only 3 categories. He says, for example, the people that you see around you are either an'amta alayhim, those people who you have blessed, غَيْرِ الْمَغْضُوبِ عَلَيْهِمْ, those people who you're angry with, وَلَا الضَّالِّينَ, and those people who are misguided. When we look at our own society, in our own day and age, we know that there are maybe a few more people, right? A few more types of people. There are people who are maybe, they know what the truth is and then they don't follow it. Yes, of course, they're the ones that Allah loves. They're the ones that Allah doesn't love. And then there are these people in between. But when we look in our day-to-day lives, we know that, for example, this person who is not Muslim, he's a good person. It's not as though that anybody who is not Muslim is a terrible person, right? That's what we experience in our own lives, among our co-workers and the people around us. And it's not the case that every Muslim is a good person. Our day-to-day lives show us that it's not just black and white, but there's a whole lot of gray in between. That's what we experience on a day-to-day basis. But the way the Quran explains the world is very different. The Quran explains the world in just black and white. So it explains it in terms of the mu'minun, in terms of the mushrikun, and in terms of the munafiqun. Those are the only three categories that Allah places. And of course, these are the mu'minun, are the people who are going to be guided and going to reach Allah's blessings. The mushrikun and the munafiqun are misguided. What is Allah trying to tell us here? What Allah is trying to say is that on a day-to-day basis, you may forget what the reality is. But what the Quran does and what the lives of the Ahlul Bayt do is that every once in a while, they will pull the covers away. They will pull all of these things away. And they will allow us to see what reality actually is like. So on the Day of Judgment, when we see things as they actually are, we will see things in terms of those people who are guided, those people who are misguided, and those people who Allah hates. That's actually how reality is. There are certain moments in history and certain moments in time where Allah pulls away all of those uncertainties, all of those things that don't allow us to see what reality is, and He shows us that these people are guided and these people are misguided. What Karbala does is it tells us, why is it so important for us to realize and understand the teachings of the Ahlul Bayt? Why is it that every single decision that we make in our lives, why are those decisions so important? We look in the progress of Imam Hussein towards Karbala, towards Kufa. When he leaves Mecca and Medina, we see that one after another, companions, close companions of the Prophet and people who were very knowledgeable come to Imam Hussein and tell him, for example, Abdullah ibn Umar. He was considered a very knowledgeable scholar of that time. He had reported many ahadith of the Prophet. He comes to Imam Hussein and he tells him, Ya Aba Abdullah, Ya Imam Hussein, don't go on this path. Why are you making all of this trouble for people? Just, he's just the Khalifa. It's not that big of a deal. You can maybe give your bay'ah, but in your heart you know that you're on the right path. Do like we do, he says. Don't make all of this trouble for yourself and for your family and for the Muslims. One after another, even some of the closest people of Imam Hussein come and tell him, this decision that you're making, don't make it so difficult. But what Imam Hussein is saying is that all of these teachings that you have been taught, all of these things that Islam is telling you, this is the moment where you are going to shine or you are going to fall into the hellfire. This is the moment where Allah is uncovering the reality for you to be able to see. If you are not on the right path, this is the moment where you are going to face your trials and tribulations. This is the moment when you are going to face that adab. You are either on the right path or you're not. There's only two decisions. There's only two ways that you are going to go. What Allah is saying, or what Imam Hussein is saying in fact, is now is the time that you have to make your decision. Now is the time. If you delay it any longer, you are going to find yourself in the wrong place. right? Every single decision that we make in our lives, they have an impact. There's a consequence. Every single decision that we make. Sometimes you might think that our single decisions that we make on a day-to-day basis really don't matter that much. But it is those moments that are the most crucial and the most critical that we see the consequences for our decisions. So when, for example, people don't understand what Abu Abdullah is trying to tell them, when they turn a blind eye to the lessons and the words of Imam Hussein, maybe at one point they don't realize what decisions they're making, but then once Karbala comes, he says this is the cutoff point. This is that point where it's no going back. This is the point where you have been either training yourself to follow the right path, or you have been misguiding yourself for that entire time. And so we see that time and time again, the Ahlul Bayt tell us, Karbala was the most crucial moment in all of Islam. In fact, Imam Hassan tells us, Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Imam Hassan tells Imam Hussein when Imam Hassan is on his deathbed. He tells Imam Hussein, he sees Imam Hussein is crying. And Imam Hassan is also crying. And Imam Hussein looks to Imam Hassan, he says, Ya Hassan, oh my brother, why are you crying? Is it because of all of the poison that's going through your body and the fact that you are reaching the state of martyrdom? Imam Hassan says no. He says, I am crying for you. I know there's going to be a day where you are going to be left alone. And he says, La yawma ka yawmaka ya Aba Abdullah. There is no day like your day, where you are going to be killed and martyred on the desert, and there's nobody who's going to be able to assist you. What Imam Hassan is trying to tell us is that Karbala is the most important event in all of Islamic history. It's going to be an event that's going to define Islamic history for the end of time. And in fact, we have a hadith from the Prophet himself and from the previous Anbiya that tell us about Imam Hussein's sacrifice. Imam Hussein's sacrifice is the most important event in all of not just Islamic history but human history. Because we see haqq and batil being defined. We see truth and falsehood being defined. Right? So it's a lot of times we try to implement the lessons of Imam Hussein, the lessons of Karbala in our lives. But at the same time, we have to realize that Imam Hussein and his sacrifice are an ideal. There's something that we can't possibly reach. And this is in fact the lives of the Ahlul Bayt in general. Sometimes we set certain goals in our lives that we can reach, right? So for example, I say in my own life, I am trying to be a better person. I'm trying to, say, control my diet. I'm not going to eat, say, for example, chocolate every day, right? I'm going to control my intake of chocolate every day. And then at another point, I say this is my ideal, right? And what the Ahlul Bayt tell us is that that ideal is so far beyond you that however hard you try, however long you try and you practice on a day-to-day basis, the ideal should be so great that even if you practice every single day, even if you take every single step on a day-to-day basis, you are never going to reach that ideal. So, the lessons that we learn from Karbala, yes, we can implement that in our lives on a day-to-day basis. But we have to understand that the lessons of Karbala are something that we are never going to be able to reach. La yawma ka yawmaka ya Aba Abdullah. This journey that we are taking towards Allah, that's a journey that never ends. What Imam Hussein is trying to tell us through Karbala is that we can take steps towards loving Imam Hussein ever more. But the ideal is always going to be just a little bit farther ahead. The ideal is always going to be just a little bit more love of the Ahlul Bayt. This is always going to be a process where we deepen that love for the Ahlul Bayt in our hearts. And the Ahlul Bayt tell us that our hearts are a never-ending. They're never-ending. Our hearts are deep as God's creation itself. And so every single day we have to try to deepen our hearts and deepen that love that we have for the Ahlul Bayt. And it's never going to stop. And so every day we have to hear the stories of the Ahlul Bayt and remember their stories and try to bring them into our lives evermore. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. And so we see very practical ways that the Ahlul Bayt give us. For example, these ayahs of Surah Al-Fajr. These final ayahs of Surah Al-Fajr. Ya ayyatuha an-nafsul mutma'inna irji'i ila rabbiki radiyatan mardiya fadkhuli fi ibadi wadkhuli jannati. We have a hadith from our Ahlul Bayt that tell us that this Surah Al-Fajr is in fact a surah for Imam Hussein himself. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Where Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam says, read this Surah Al-Fajr every single day in your prayers. Read it in both your nawafil as well as your wajib prayers. Those mustahab prayers as well as your wajib prayers. Because this is a reminder for you of what the stakes are, first of all. What the stakes are, what the consequences for each action that you take in your day-to-day lives, what those stakes are. Because Surah Al-Fajr also talks about the Day of Judgment. Ji'a yawma idin bi Jahannam. On that day, Jahannam itself is going to be brought. And insan, mankind, is going to be reminded of his own life. And all of the things that he did in his life. And then Allah ends this ayah with, Ya ayyatuha nafsul mutma'inna. If you are trying to reach that ideal, nafsul mutma'inna is, nafs of course we all have, right? But it's that nafsul mutma'inna that we are all trying to reach. Fadkhuli fi ibadi wadkhuli jannati. If we are able to reach even a small glimpse of that nafsul mutma'inna, then we can take pride in ourselves and take pride in what we have done and the lives that we have led. So Imam al-Sadiq tells us, recite this Surah Al-Fajr on a day-to-day basis, because this is a surah that has been recited, that has been revealed for and about Imam Hussein. And so if you recite this surah on a day-to-day basis, you will be reminded of the sacrifice of Imam Hussein, and you will be brought closer and closer every single day to Imam Hussein. And we see that in Ashura, on the day of Ashura, we see that it is this same remembering, the same memory, and the same presence of the Prophet and those people that Imam Hussein really cared about, that Imam Hussein looks to on the day of Ashura. When he looks at his son, Ali al-Akbar, he says, when he is going to send him off into the battle, he looks to Allah and he says, Oh Allah, I am sending off the person who is ashbahun nas khalqan wa khulqan wa mantiqan bi Rasulillah. I am sending the one person who is the closest reminder and the closest memory that we all have of the Prophet of Allah. That person who we are supposed to have the closest wilayah towards, the closest connection and love towards, I am sending the one person who reminds me the most of the Prophet of Allah in both the way he looks and the way he acts and the way he speaks. Ali al-Akbar is the closest person to the Prophet of Allah. And Imam Hussein is saying, Oh Allah, I am willing to sacrifice even this memory in your path. Oh Allah, look at these people. They have forgotten the memory of your Prophet. They don't have the love of the Prophet of Islam in their hearts, and they are going to sacrifice even this one memory that I have of the Prophet. Oh Allah, never accept, even if they were to ask for forgiveness of you. Oh Allah, this is that moment, that final moment. And so Imam Hussein looks to Ali al-Akbar, and he is the first among the Ahlul Bayt that Imam Hussein sends off into the battle. And he sends him with a very heavy heart, and yet he knows that it is the Ali al-Akbar, that closest person to himself, is the one that he has to send in first. And so Imam Hussein sends him off into the battlefield. And yet we see, it is reported that once he sends him off, Ali al-Akbar, once he is going into the battlefield, he hears something behind him, and he sees that it is his father that is walking behind him and coming closer and closer to him. And Ali al-Akbar, he says, "Oh Imam Hussein, oh my father, didn't you send me off and give me the ability and the permission to go and fight for you? So why are you following me now?" And Imam Hussein says, "Oh Ali, you don't know what it's like for a father to send his son into battle. You don't know what it's like for a father to sacrifice his son. It is with such a heavy heart that I send you into battle, because I know what is going to come." And it is this love between Imam Hussein and Ali al-Akbar that we see time and time again in Karbala. And so Ali al-Akbar goes and fights a very valiant fight and a very courageous fight. And then at one point he turns around and he goes back to the camp. And he says to his father, "Oh father, this thirst is really weighing me down. Is there any sort of water, any drop of water that I can have? Oh Imam Hussein, these iron, these weapons are weighing me down. Oh father, is there anything that you can do, any water that you have?" And Imam Hussein says, "Oh Ali, if you only knew how thirsty I was as well. Don't worry, oh Ali, you are going to be fed, and Allah Himself is going to give you water. Oh Ali, go back and fight, because only shortly your grandfather is going to give you that water and is going to quench your thirst." And maybe what was going through the mind of Ali al-Akbar is that, oh, if it's only one last time that I can see the face of my father, because I know that it is that moment that I have to give my life. And so Ali al-Akbar turns around and he goes back into the battle. And Imam Hussein sees him off, and he sees that this is the final time that he is going to see his son. And so Ali goes into battle and he fights a very valiant fight. And then finally, one of the enemies of Imam Hussein comes up from behind and he attacks him. And Ali al-Akbar, he tries to dodge that sword, and it hits him in the back of his head. And so he bends his head, and the blood is falling on the horse. And instead of the horse going back towards the camp, it goes farther and farther into the enemy. And it is said that Ali falls off his horse, and the horses trample over his body. And so when Imam Hussein finally comes over the body of Ali al-Akbar, he sees that not only have the horses trampled his body, but there were 1,000 cuts on the body of Ali al-Akbar, this beloved son of Imam Hussein. Can you imagine what it must feel like for a father to not just come upon the body of his son, but in such a state where he can't even tell the body parts from themselves? And he sees that his body is cut up into 1,000 different pieces. It is said that his body was cut up irban irba, like a piece of flour, like a flower that the petals are ripped apart onto the floor. And Imam Hussein says, "Oh Allah, I have given this sacrifice in your path. Oh Allah, accept this one sacrifice from me." إنا لله وإنا إليه راجعون وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون صلوا على محمد وآل محمد